How long can Israel's government dismiss the pressure? The U.S. Defense Secretary in Israel after a week where Joe Biden and Binyamin Netanyahu, for the first time in 10 weeks of war, pointedly aired their differences publicly over the way Israel's conducting its ground operation in Gaza and the plan for what happens next. We'll ask about the mounting pressure from allies and the mounting domestic pressure after last week's killing of 3 escaped hostages by Israeli forces. For the first time this past Saturday, a rally for those abducted by Hamas clearly turned into an anti-Netanyahu rally. The voice of an interest group or a turning point for a nation, and the legacy of its dominant figure in politics over the past quarter century. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the growing pressure on Israel, and joining us from Tel Aviv, pollster Mitchell Barak, Chief of Staff for then Finance Minister Binyamin Netanyahu. That was a while ago. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. First of all, I'm in Jerusalem, and I worked for him when he was the deputy minister.
Deputy minister.
Before he.
What year was it?
It was 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
30 years ago in the Gulf War, and he hasn't changed.
Okay, we'll hear more about that in a moment. Thanks for being with us from Jerusalem. He's a former French consul to Jerusalem, knows it well. Jean de Glignesti, thank you for being with us today. You are research director at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, IRIS. Thanks for being with us. From Washington, D.C., Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington. How are you?
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you. And we'll be joined shortly by our Jerusalem correspondent, Iris Makler. Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. This is a quote from the father of one of 3 of the hostages that were killed last week by Israel's army. Our army doesn't know how to observe open fire regulations. This is, again, the father of a slain hostage, Alon Shamritz. It's a story that has shaken Israel to its core. Emerald Maxwell has more.
In a kibbutz north of Tel Aviv, a family grieves. Alon Shamritz was just 26 years old when, along with 2 other Israeli hostages, he was killed by Israeli soldiers, mistakenly, they say, in Gaza on Friday. At his funeral on Sunday, his family expressed their anger at the government.
Against all the odds, you escaped and did everything you could to come home. It's so cruel. Those who abandoned you also murdered you after you did everything right.
The 3 hostages were shot dead during an operation in a Gaza City suburb by soldiers who identified them as a threat, even as they carried a white flag and cried for help in Hebrew. The army released photos of signs they say they found on the walls of a building where the 3 men had been hiding. SOS and Help 3 hostages, written in Hebrew on white cloth, likely with leftover food. Since then, the army has made a series of announcements and says it has learnt lessons from its mistake. The killings prompted hostages' families to take to the streets again. They're calling for the Israeli government to reopen negotiations with Hamas to secure the release of the nearly 130 hostages still held in Gaza.
And we are joined by Iris Makler, our correspondent in Jerusalem. The news came through late on Friday. It's now Monday. Is it still the talking point where you are?
Yes, it is. I think the fallout from that will shake this country for a long time. Even Israel's Prime Minister, who didn't speak on the Friday night, said that he had been thinking about it. You know, what if only, imagine if just this thing hadn't happened. The thought that they survived for 70 days and were then gunned down when they were coming out with their arms up, carrying a white flag, it's unbearably painful, not only to their families. And it's interesting because we heard a very firm rebuttal of their behaviour from Israel's military chief of staff. And he said, you do not shoot at someone who comes out with their hands up, carrying a white flag. It doesn't matter what nationality they are, and it doesn't matter if they're Palestinians. You don't do that. Just think for 2 seconds before you pull the trigger. So that was quite a firm stand taken against that, even though it seems at the moment that they will not be disciplined.
Now, the news of that broke on Friday. You mentioned the precepts there by the head of the military, and yet now we're getting the United States, which has raised concerns with Israel about reports that an Israeli sniper shot dead 2 Christian women. This happened in a compound in the Gaza Strip over the weekend. The Pope even getting involved, saying that Israel's military was, quote, employing terrorism tactics. The mother, who'd gone to the bathroom in the compound of the Church of the Holy Parish in Gaza, and then her daughter subsequently was shot dead. The church blames an Israeli sniper. Israel's government insists it doesn't shoot unarmed civilians.
Well, I think that's hard to believe, frankly, because the people in Gaza and the Cardinal Archbishop of Jerusalem, they're not given to tell lies.
So you don't believe the Israeli Defense Force?
No, I don't.
Iris Makler, this kind of adds on another layer.
Yes, it does. Although I have to say, I've just seen a denial from the Israeli Defense Forces that they were responsible for that shooting. I'm just throwing that in. You know, we're not in Gaza, and I can't tell you if that's right or not. It's just that I saw it as I was coming on air. It adds another layer. It adds to the fear that people have here, that the army, and not just the army, the police also have become trigger happy, that there is, that those words were actually used. I read one analyst saying, this isn't only a tragedy, speaking about the 3 soldiers who were shot, the 3 hostages who were shot, it's also a crime. So there is a reckoning that I think the Israeli army definitely has to have, but maybe other armed people within Israel, including its border police and its police forces, over how readily they pull the trigger.
Mitchell Barak, there was the former UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace over the weekend telling one of the Sunday newspapers how he's worried that Israel's military is simply acting on revenge, with revenge in their heart, and not prosecuting this in a manner they should. Your thoughts on how the military is doing after these incidents?
Well, it's beyond tragic, that story. I mean, it's beyond tragic, and I think we have to look at it, and it's painful, and it is probably one of the worst stories that we've heard from this whole horrible last 2 months. I think we have to look at how the army is handling it, and Iris is right. They are out front that is not the rules of engagement. And, you know, the chief of staff was very clear about that, and we have to learn our lessons from it. We have to learn how to use our heads. And I think that's the big lesson that is coming out of this, that civilians are people that are surrendering, or people that look like civilians. You don't open fire. And
the fact that the United States is raising concern about the shooting death of those 2 Christian women?
That has been in the news. I can't tell you the details of that, and if the army has denied it, I would like to see how that plays out. It's certainly a tragedy. I can tell you from having kids in the army now, and all of my kids' friends are serving many of them are in Gaza. It is not an easy situation, and I wouldn't want to even judge those soldiers who shot the hostages, what was going through their mind, what happened before, why they might have thought it was a threat. There certainly were cases that even during the ceasefire, when the hostages were being traded, there were roadside bombs, there were suicide bombs, there was shooting at Israeli soldiers. So it is a very tense situation there. There is hand-to-hand combat. That is why the casualties every day from the Israeli side are mounting, because it's very, very difficult fighting there. So whereas I think we need to separate what happens, as was brought up, with the police and the border police and other people during regular times or in places that are not as tense. But I can tell you from, what I've heard from people that have been to Gaza and are in there actively fighting, it is not an easy thing. And in fact, that it's been published that there have been many soldiers killed through friendly fire because of the crossfire in between different units, and sometimes that's lack of communication. That sometimes, because visibility is low, communication is not good. This is what happens when you're fighting a very difficult war like this against an enemy that looks like civilians, that's hiding in tunnels, that pop out every so often. It is a very difficult situation.
Very difficult situation. Hussein Ibish, what's your reading of the conversation that's going on in Israel?
I think Israelis are largely in denial about what's happening because they're still traumatized by October 7, and that's understandable from a human point of view. Israelis and Palestinians are both behaving like human beings. Human beings tend to be, especially when they're traumatized and acting in collectivities like national groups, tend to very easily be reduced to tribal and primal states. And that's where we are. Israel doesn't actually have an achievable political goal in this war. The only thing that has given it shape so far that makes sense, there is this rhetoric about destroying Hamas, but that's not possible. The only thing that really makes sense is when Netanyahu says, this is a war of vengeance. We will avenge the killings. We will avenge October 7th. That scans, and I think that's what's playing out here. And once Israel develops a plausible political goal and scenario, then it can stop acting with such indiscriminate force, which even Joe Biden, the biggest defender of this war, had to admit to. And both of these cases, the killing of these shirtless, white flag waving escaped hostages and the murder of these two women who were trying to use the toilet in a church in Gaza, demonstrates the extent to which the Israeli military is simply shooting whatever moves in Gaza. I think the death tolls, which are largely, something like 70% civilian, and probably at least half children, reflect that as well. And I think we just have to be honest here that there is a huge element of vengeance, deliberate, calculated vengeance going on here. And that's because Israelis are human beings, and that's what human beings do. By the way, we saw that on October 7 too. There was a lot of vengeance in that as well.
Yeah, Jean de Glignasti, 74 days now, and we're still in vengeance mode. You agree with Hussein Ibish?
Yes, I would say that at first time it was a revenge for the atrocities of October 7th. And now it seems to be a revenge against the resistance of Hamas, because the fact is that Hamas is resisting. And when you want to crush your opponent without suffering losses, then you become trigger happy. And that's what's happened.
All right. And well, for its counter-narrative, Israel's military organizing a press tour on Sunday of a large tunnel wide enough to drive a car in, that it says stretches for 4 kilometers, part of the so-called Gaza Metro, that network of tunnels that is the target of the current operation.
Yeah.
And this is the tunnel that they used to attack the Erez crossing.
Cement, very strong cement.
Urs Makler, if it was so close to the border, Hamas did a pretty good job if the Israeli forces weren't able to seize on it.
That's right. They didn't know. I mean, I've heard a couple of military officers conceding that they didn't know about it until they found it. And there was also a tape that they released of it actually being built. You know, they had equipment, they had lights. It looked like an advertisement for the equipment. You know, it was a very well conducted, well funded, well built construction. And Israel didn't know about it, didn't know about it when it was happening, didn't know about it when the machines were brought in to do it, and then didn't have intelligence about it. It wasn't used on October the 7th, by the way. Perhaps they were planning it for a backup attack. It's not clear, but it came out something like, 200 meters from 400 meters maximum from the areas crossing from the border. That's the crossing that people use as opposed to goods, which was Kerem Shalom. So, it was easily a huge threat and also another intelligence failure.
Mitchell Barak, your reaction?
It was a big failure. I mean, that's the first thing, is how close it is to the border, how they were probably going to just extend it past the 400 meters to actually bring in thousands and thousands of people had they wanted to attack Israel, and how they could, definitely move things over a long distance. So the first thing is correct. The intelligence failure, we didn't hear it being built. We didn't know about it. I mean, probably hundreds of people worked on that. How come we didn't know about it? So that's the first thing. But yes, it is very, very sophisticated, the way they did it. I always go back when I see these things, I always wonder to myself, because I worked for Prime Minister Ariel Sharon when he announced the disengagement plan from Gaza. And, had in 2005 when Israel left it, I mean, they have certain capabilities and even ingenuity here and determination. I mean, imagine what they could have done to the Gaza Strip beachfront property.
What was the plan back then? What was Ariel Sharon's idea of what would happen in Gaza?
I think that there was a number of things. One of the things is many of those settlements were very isolated and very difficult to defend. And, I think he felt that Israel's security would be better off letting them control that area, trying to do something with it, and making a clear border rather than having, settlements there. It was a very, very bold move. It was very, very controversial for, half of the population, at least, the population that is now, controlling the Knesset and the Netanyahu government. And, remember, there was elections in Hamas won elections in 2007. There was an international airport that Bill Clinton came to open, and Yasser Arafat was there. It could have actually worked, meaning Fatah and Hamas didn't get they never really got along. But, they definitely billions and billions of dollars were poured into the Gaza Strip. The Hamas, as we found out from the New York Times, was also very good at making their own investments and having their own income-generating businesses. They could have actually made something good for the people of Gaza. I never got the impression in the past 15 years that the people of Gaza are being served in any good way. And this is unfortunate. And then many of them, came into Israel and worked in Israel. And the potential for cooperation or for actually using that same, abilities to kill more Israelis in more efficient and more creative ways could have been used to, try and self-determination, try and rule Gaza.
Yeah, as you were saying, Mitch, with each week that passes comes revelations of Israel's intelligence failures. The New York Times, you're alluding to that piece, reports that in 2016, Prime Minister Netanyahu dismantled something called Harpoon. It was a financial crimes unit of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Mossad. The then head of Harpoon, Udi Levy, recalls a briefing 1 year earlier in 2015 where he told the Prime Minister about Hamas's money-making schemes abroad. The Prime Minister, I can tell you for sure that I talked to him about this, Levy said, but he didn't care that much about it. Hussein Ibish, why didn't he care?
Well, he didn't care because the far right in Israel in general, but especially the far right in Israel, has always had a kind of a partnership with Hamas, where they've tried to use Hamas to split the Palestinian national movement between Islamists and secular nationalists. And the far right then wants to claim that it can't negotiate with the PLO because Hamas is there, it's not part of the PLO. And even though PLO represents the Palestinians diplomatically, there's Hamas, so they're split, so there's no one to talk to. I mean, this is the logic that is used to escape the problem that if you get into negotiations with Palestinians, then it only makes sense that they lead ultimately to a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu is now boasting about how he personally blocked the creation of a Palestinian state, and he deserves the credit for that, and that's a great thing for Israel, supposedly. And so Hamas has been a crucial part of the plan to do that by the Israeli far right. And that's why Netanyahu is quoted as having told a group of Knesset members in 2018 from the Likud party that everyone like us who wants to block the creation of a Palestinian state has to support, has to back supporting Hamas and transferring money to Hamas, not Israeli money, but like Qatari money and international money and money they get from their crooked schemes and rackets and whatever they run, to make money. And they certainly engage in all kinds of criminal activities. And he didn't care because it was very useful. And I think the biggest intelligence failure was October 7. There was this sense that Hamas was kind of under control, and obviously it wasn't. So it's no surprise that Israel is finding all kinds of things in Gaza that it didn't know about or anticipate. That's what happened in Lebanon in 2006, when Israel was shocked to find that Hezbollah was capable not just of acting like a guerrilla force, but also had aspects of a conventional military that they could seize and hold territory. So, states that fight insurgent groups that have had a long time to prepare are generally surprised that they don't encounter the same group from 8 years ago, 9 years ago, 10 years ago. That's pretty normal, but it's also pretty pathetic.
Jean-Luc Lignesti, just a moment about the history part of it. When you were stationed in Jerusalem, was the writing on the wall already for this sort of divide and rule that Mitchell Barak was mentioning, and this sort of incomprehension over what could be?
No, at that time everything was simpler. I mean,
this was just after the Oslo Accords, right?
Yes, just after. At that time, Hamas was a weak movement. The PLO was triumphant, and everybody believed in peace, of course. And the relations between the Israeli government and the PLO and Yasser Arafat in particular were rather good, I would say. And there was a certain level of trust at that time.
Yes.
At Sunday's Israeli cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister staying on message, the message we've heard since October the 7th.
We will achieve all our goals, the elimination of Hamas, the release of all our hostages, and a promise that Gaza will not once again become a hub for inciting terror and attacks against the state of Israel. We will continue to fight until the end, for the sake of the fallen and for the assurance of our lives here in the land of Israel.
Earlier in the conversation, Mitchell Barak, you heard Hussein Ibish cast doubt on Israel ever being able to completely stamp out Hamas in the terms you just heard described there by the Israeli Prime Minister. I guess two questions. First of all, is this the same message Binyamin Netanyahu's had consistently since he first became Prime Minister back in 1996? Or is this a new kind of messaging?
No, this is the new kind of message that he's saying now after October 7th, because as we've said, and it's been proven, Hamas and Hussein said, Hamas was a good kind of low intensity foe. They couldn't do too much damage, and they didn't want to have a Palestinian state, and they also fought with Fatah in the West Bank. So, he could divide the Palestinians where Fatah has the West Bank and Hamas has Gaza. So it served is purpose because, again, his main goal is not being against the Palestinian state. But, I think a lot of what what is the plan to wipe out Hamas? Meaning, they still are probably a lot of Hamas terrorists, which are still there. And I would also think that due to the horrible and evil success that they had on October 7th of killing so many Israelis and raping them and taking hostage, that they'll be able to recruit many more. Because unfortunately, this is what, people look at and inspires those people, those many, many people that want to kill Israelis and believe that the state of Israel has no right to exist, and they're going to wipe us off the map. So it's going to be very, very difficult, to totally destroy Hamas, and it's also going to be difficult to get back 130 hostages when we don't know where those hostages are. I think even Hamas doesn't necessarily know where some of those hostages are. Like 3 of them that escaped, and some of them have been killed. Where are those bodies? I'm not convinced that these are, as Hussein said earlier, that these are real achievable goals. They certainly are goals that rally the Israeli public, and the Israeli public can get behind. And we have to be united in this goal. But again, talking about the plan even for the day after Gaza, it's been difficult for Netanyahu to even speak to our biggest backers, which is the United States and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State and even President Joe Biden. Who's going to be ruling Gaza and make sure it doesn't turn into a terrorist state? And he hasn't really provided an answer. He speaks, as I said in our last interview, he's not bilingual, he's duolingual. He says one thing in English to the English-speaking audience and one thing in Hebrew for the right-of-center Israeli audience that votes for him.
And Iris Makler, it's been a winning formula on and off since 1996.
Yeah, it was a winning formula, let's say, till October the 7th. I think that
He's still there
is a
now.
watershed moment. Yeah, no, you're right. It is December the 19th, as you say to me. That's true. But I think part of all of this, we can't talk about the day after, and we must, setting these unreasonable goals means that it's a war that will never be won. If you ask him, it'll take 2 or 3 years and he'll be in charge right till the end. So I think there's a great deal of self-interest in setting these unwinnable goals, because he keeps saying any politics has to be left till the day after, as he calls it, the day after the war. While half of these statements are actually all political hot air for the right wing he's trying to win back, because the polls are very bad for him. So even the right wing has abandoned him. And he's trying to win them back with these empty slogans and a war that will last forever so that he can sit in that chair forever. I think that's actually part of how he's been running this.
Very briefly, Mitchell Barak, does your research show that it could work, his strategy?
Well, he's beaten the polls many times, and he knows that what people are saying today is not relevant when there's an actual election. And I think he's already identified his campaign, which is the greatest threat to Israel now is going to be a Palestinian state. Right. And he's the only one that's going to stop it, which is interesting because one of the reasons October 7th happened is because we were so close to closing with Saudi Arabia and many other countries. Exactly. The one thing that was holding it back was what's going to happen with the Palestinians. So now I think that's more on the table right now. And how is he going to be the one to stop that and to rebuild after the war? But he's gonna run a campaign. He's, as Iris says, he's already started with the messaging, and he's been playing politics. He's not been the unifier of Israel. He's not reached out to any of the other political parties besides the one that joined his government. There's already reports that
those rallies by hostage families don't matter.
No, they do matter. And in fact, in a most bizarre statement, Gal Hirsch, who's the government-appointed head of getting back the hostages, told the families to stop with the demonstrations. And I think, obviously, the demonstrations are picking up since that terrible tragedy. And people are saying, it's enough. We've got to get those hostages back. That has to be the main priority now. And that's why we see an increased negotiation that involves the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, the Qatari PM, and the head of the Mossad. The only thing I'll say about that is it's fascinating that the CIA is really negotiating with a terror organization, with Hamas, meaning they're doing it through an agent. But since when does the United States negotiate with terrorists?
Always.
It's shocking.
Jean de Grigny, are you shocked that?
No, I think, 5 years before the Oslo Agreement, Yasser Arafat was deemed a terrorist. Yeah. So I think Hamas in 5 years, once the military organization has been eradicated in Gaza, there will remain the political organization. And for most of Palestinians, Hamas represents them in some way. No, there is the PLO, there is the Fatah, but there is also the Hamas. If you want to negotiate with the Palestinians, you have to take account of Hamas. So perhaps in a few years, Hamas will be an interlocutor, whatever.
All right, but certainly not at this moment. What is clear is we're seeing the domestic pressure in Israel. We've talked about it. There's also more and more foreign pressure. We're speaking ahead of yet another UN Security Council vote. Two of Israel's closest allies also upping the pressure in a joint piece by the foreign ministers of Britain and Germany. David Cameron and Annalena Baerbock disagreeing with calling right now for a general immediate ceasefire, hoping it somehow becomes permanent is the way forward. They say that's wrong. But the pair, writing in the Sunday Times, do think we must do all we can to pave way to a sustainable ceasefire, leading to a sustainable peace. I'm not quite sure what a sustainable ceasefire and a sustainable peace means, but at this particular point, what we did see was that while the head of the CIA is in Warsaw negotiating over truces that can free hostages, in Israel, the Defense Secretary of the United States, Lloyd Austin, in town this Monday. He spoke alongside his Israeli counterpart.
And I know that Israel has been profoundly changed from where you were on October 6th. So I'm here with a clear message. America's support for Israel's security is unshakable. And Israel is not alone.
Hussein Ibish, you're not going to get much out of Lloyd Austin to find out what exactly was discussed behind closed doors. Your thoughts on this particular visit?
So he's been delegated to play that role because he's the leader of the U.S. military. So from day one, he's been the biggest bearer, along with President Biden, but even more than President Biden, of the bear hug. And that's, he hasn't said anything else at all. Now, you've gotten much more nuanced comments from people like Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and other lesser officials who have more room. The head of the military is supposed to reassure Israelis, and that's part of the strategy of the Biden administration, the bear hug yielding leverage which can produce Israeli restraint. That's the theory. I just want to point something out. Israel and Netanyahu are not the only parties under pressure. Right? There is such a thing as domestic Palestinian politics. And Hamas has a political goal, unlike Israel. It's had a political goal from the beginning, which has to do with taking over the Palestinian national movement. But they are under heavy political pressure because of the devastation that they have created, as a result of October 7. And as long as Israel stays, the Israelis sort of deflect criticism, but as soon as Israel leaves, they may find themselves in a political fiasco. That happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006. And this is reflected in a statement by Hamas leader in Qatar, Musa Abu Marzouk. He's a very important Hamas leader, which was a breakthrough. He said not only that Hamas was ready to recognize Israel, but that Hamas wants to join the PLO on Fatah's terms, accept the 1993 recognition of Israel by Yasser Arafat on behalf of the PLO, and join the PLO on that basis. He might just be talking for himself, but if he reflects a really solid group in Qatar that might reemerge as the leadership of Hamas if the local guys in Gaza are all killed and captured, that opens a potential pathway for Hamas to either accept an alternative Palestinian leadership tacitly and sort of pull back a little bit, and then join the PLO, and whether they really reform or not, pretend to be sort of Hamas 3.0 and get into the business of negotiations and try to take over the PLO that way. I think it's a very interesting possibility. It suggests that Qatar might be the key. Qatar might become the de facto international fiduciary for Gaza, brokering all of this among Palestinians, squaring it with the Israelis and the Americans, and paying for the initial reconstruction and stabilization in Gaza in coordination with an alternative Palestinian leadership there that doesn't include Hamas, but that has the kind of tacit acceptance of Hamas.
So, Mitchell Barak, I see you shaking your head. What's your scenario, or one of the possible scenarios that you see for the day after?
Well, everyone here is old enough to remember The Who, the rock band, and one of their hit songs is "We Won't Get Fooled Again." So that's how I would sum up Mr. Marzouk's lovely statements from Qatar, which has shielded the Hamas leadership for so many years. And Qatar, is playing an important role here, certainly with the hostages, but one has to ask themselves, they kind of dabble in supporting terror, dabble in, in having Al Jazeera promote lies when they need to, or real news when they want. And, what does Qatar want to be when they grow up? They can have the World Cup, but at the end of the day, they're providing money and cover to terror organizations. And one has to ask themselves, why do they have 28 active registered lobbyists in Washington? It's a country of 3 million people. What are they hiding there? What are they lobbying for?
They have the biggest lobby in Washington, which is the Pentagon. But, you're absolutely right. Everything you said about Qatar is right. But there has to be a plan for the day after in Gaza. What I described is a way for Israel to get out of the trap that Gaza has become for Israel, for Hamas to get out of the political trap that it's set for itself by what it's created, this disaster it's created in Gaza, and it's a way for Qatar to get out of the trap you just described, where there might be a reckoning for them with this long history of supporting Hamas and not changing their policies after October 7, which is shocking. So all three are looking for a way out, and that could be a way out. I don't think it'll necessarily happen, but it's the first thing I've ever thought of or heard about that could work as a day after scenario.
Jean de Glignesti, your day after scenario.
I think there is no scenario.
There's no scenario.
Well, the worst case scenario, I would say, because what's happening now is that there is no political perspective. There is no political solution in sight. Perhaps
no political solution. Are you saying on the Palestinian side or on the Israeli side?
For the Palestinian question, I mean, the two state, one state, no state, all that is, well, I would say bullshit. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Even those who are advocating the two-state solution know perfectly well that you have 500,000 settlers, and you won't expel them. It's not possible anymore. They are dedicated. They have heavy armament. You can't do that. So the two-state solution is dead, or at least very ill. Those who are advocating one-state solution, Israel will never accept that because it's the end of the gist of the Israeli state. And when Netanyahu says, "I don't want a Palestinian state," any Palestinian state, it means that there is no political solution. That's why, I mean, the world would have accepted that Israel eradicates completely, devastated Gaza and so, but to what end? All this seems to be an endless tragedy.
Then Hamas is the big winner. For sure, Hamas emerges the big winner if all of that is true.
Iris Makler, it's day 74. And I get back to what we were talking about earlier about this thirst for revenge. Is anybody having the conversation we're having in Israel about the day after?
They're being stopped by their prime minister, who raises his hand and says, no, leave it with me. And whatever is put forward that isn't from him, he says, while I am prime minister, that will not happen. So he has a long list, as they say here, of what he won't accept, and not a very long list at all, a list with nothing on it of what he's proposing in its place. The only thing he has actually said is that he wants Gaza to be demilitarized. That's the only actual description that I've heard from him of what the day after in Gaza will look like. Other than that, not much. And by the way, I wanted to say to Hussein Ibish that I also saw that piece from Musa Abu Marzouk. But then I saw later in the day it had been very unpopular in Gaza and that he'd pulled it back and said that actually maybe not for now or, for later. So even someone who has the courage or the thought for a moment to put that forward has to immediately pull it back while this war goes on in Gaza. So maybe this state of endless war suits certain parties, actually.
Of course it does.
It suits certain parties, but Iris, it brings us back to again all that international pressure that we're seeing, and I guess and the domestic pressure, which you heard Mitchell Barak say is a factor.
On the Saturday night following the shooting of the 3 hostages on Friday was the first time that I actually saw anti-Netanyahu protesters in amongst the people who were coming to support the hostages. So when I say it suits certain parties, I'm of course not thinking of the civilians in Gaza, and I'm not thinking of anyone who was injured or killed on October the 7th, who's taken hostage there, or even, the parents of the soldiers who died in Gaza, the Israeli soldiers. Yeah. War is terrible, and this war is particularly terrible. But I don't think there's not enough clever politicians here thinking of the end game. There's a very tired, very old, truculent man who's been in charge for a very long time and doesn't want to let go, who's not thinking of an end game for different reasons. So for all of those reasons, I think that's why I say, it suits certain people and it suits Hamas, I must say, for this endless war to go ahead.
Mitchell Barak, at the outset of our conversation, you quipped that it's the same Binyamin Netanyahu as when you worked for the then deputy finance minister. Is it really?
Look, I used to say at the time, I would call him Sisyphus, and he's governed like the prime minister of Sisyphus. He works on fixing a problem which he himself created in order to make another problem which he himself is going to solve. So, that's what I would say then. He operates in a certain level of political chaos where only he likes to see the chaos.
And visibly, Israelis like it because they keep voting for him.
They keep voting for him because he keeps listen, he's only run. Remember, he got into politics by accident because his brother died ironically rescuing hostages in Entebbe. And every election, he's not run on the economy, he's not run on peace, he's run on the enemy. He's the guy who's going to stop the Palestinians, stop the Iranians, stop Barack Obama from threatening Israel and threatening the settlements. It was always a security thing. And he always ran on security. So ironically, I've said Israelis found out on October 7th that Mr. Security might just be a Ponzi scheme. And it wasn't there because we didn't know anything. The last thing, because I see we're wrapping up, meaning I think that Palestinians and Israelis have at least one thing in common, and that's for the day after. Both of us deserve better leadership. Okay? Yes. Israelis need to get in leadership, and I don't know who that leader in Israel is going to be, but I know the model is going to be like when Bennett and Lapid were the alternating prime ministers, meaning it doesn't really matter who the prime minister is. There needs to be a broad consensus of parties and to decide on who is the guy or the woman sitting in the chair who's going to make the decisions with consensus. And that's what we're going to need for the day after. But on the other side, we're going to need Palestinians who's not in his mid-80s, who's been serving for 17 years, who actually does security coordination with the IDF on the West Bank, but also supports terror. We're going to need someone on the other side, probably much younger, who says they want to come to some kind of agreement so that the Palestinians have a better future in the West Bank and in Gaza, and how you're going to fix that problem, because it's just not, the price to pay for both sides is just too great. It's too devastating. It's unfortunate to live here.
Jean de Glignesti.
It's true, but up to now it was impossible, and I'm afraid it will be impossible.
Hussein Ibish, can you please try to counter that? We can't finish on a low like that.
The only thing I want to counter is the idea that Abbas supports terror. I think that's completely exact. That's hyperbole, and that's not true. But everything else you can say about Abbas is right. He's become corrupt. He's become timid. He's not capable of even being the national leader of the Palestinians. He's the mayor of Ramallah, and he's got to go. Now, luckily, he will go. And hopefully, as Mitchell was saying, we get better people, younger people. But Israel is going to have to stop treating the Palestinian Authority and the PLO as a joke and as a thing to be toyed with and humiliated and made to look ridiculous. Israelis can choose to deal with Palestinians who want to talk to them and make a deal, or Palestinians who want to shoot them and kill them. And those are the two choices. And trying to support both and contain both and split and deal and have them, fighting each other, that led to October 7th. So if you want more October 7th, you just continue with that policy of divide and rule.
We'll have to leave it there for now. So much more to talk about. I want to thank you, Hussein Ibish, for being with us from Washington, Mitchell Barak and Iris Makler in Jerusalem. Jean de Glignasti, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.